Laura, this episode is awesome. We have such an incredible guest. I don't even want to say because I want to let her introduce herself. I don't know. What do you want to say?
Yeah, no, I think we'll let our guests introduce themselves. But what I really want, and I was really pleased with this discussion and what's coming up, is there's loads of takeaways, particularly for parents. There's some really good tips in there about engaging with their young people on some really important topics. We always like our guests to introduce themselves, and this week we have the wonderful Melissa Mercado. Melissa, please can you introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Hello, everybody. My name is Melissa Mercado. I serve as a lead behavioral scientist on the Division of Violence Prevention at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC.
Thanks. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do at the CDC? I mean, and specifically, I think we're kind of curious for our listeners, like, what's the CDC have to do with digital media, with anything digital? Like, what? Explain that, please.
Well, I am a researcher. I'm not on the communications, information dissemination, health education aspect of things, but that's one way in which we work with media, with digital media. But I have to say that, right? They're fantastic. I love my comms team. But from my perspective, from the research perspective, I am a researcher on violence prevention, and we know that violence can happen online or offline. Therefore, it is important to understand what is happening online, to know that what happens online doesn't always stay online, and it can have real impact, especially talking about specifically violence prevention, which is my area. It can have impact in people's individual emotional, psychological, and even physical health well-being. So we are looking into that. We are interested in understanding what is happening online, right? For example, cyberbullying, harassment, stalking that happens online. We also want to understand the good stuff that is happening online, all the pro-social benefits of online, and how can those be leveraged to prevent violence online and offline. And also looking at online spaces as a platform, right? As the tool for disseminating messages, for implementing interventions for the prevention of violence, both virtually and in the physical world.
Wow.
This whole the whole. I mean, it's sort of a public health perspective. Is that a fair way?
Correct.
Yeah, and I think that's out of a lot of people's purview. Like, we don't think a lot about this idea. Like, we hear CDC, we think, oh, you must be dealing with, like, invisible germs, right?
We do
Yeah.
that too.
But there's a whole public health initiative that people don't think about. Is that right? Am I understanding that correctly?
Absolutely. And violence is a public health problem because of the consequences that it can have in physical and mental well-being and health. It affects our communities, it affects individuals, it affects lifespan. There's a burden in terms of the injuries, right? For life expectancy, for youth, for young adults, and all of our communities. So it is important that we do consider violence as a public health problem. And that's the approach that we're taking. If you look at the public health model, we first need to understand what is happening. Who is it affecting it? What is the risk and protective factor for it? How can we leverage it? Design interventions, rigorously test them, and if they work, widespread dissemination. We want everybody to know about it.
That's great. So, how do you define digital violence? Like, where's the line between, like, I'm in a game with my friends and it involves shooting and it involves a level of virtual violence, right? Versus when does that become actual, the kind of violence that the CDC would be concerned with, or the kind of violence that we can be concerned with from a public health perspective?
I know what you're talking about. And you made me think of my husband. When I got married to him first time, I knew he was a gamer, right? But if I was in another room and I didn't know the context and who he was playing with, I would think that they were getting at each other's throats. Oh
Mhm.
my God, it would be concerning. But he was playing with his best bud, and they were very competitive and very friendly in nature. So where is that line? How do we distinguish that? Good point. We don't know. It's challenging. It is a big challenge. It's something that we need to look at. But going back to your question of defining digital violence, That's a challenge right now in the literature. We actually completed recently a literature review looking at different forms of violence and online spaces. And in the same research literature, there are inconsistent definitions. So that is something that must be addressed. But we do know that different forms of violence can have a manifestation and interpretation. It can appear through online spaces or can be facilitated through online spaces. Cyberbullying, bullying, sexual violence, harassment, intimate partner violence. We've also seen research coming out of how online spaces have been used to facilitate in-person violence from gangs and other types of community violence.
So I know, Melissa, we have met several times before. We've been involved in a few projects, and I know that you spoke at a huge conference this year, the South by Southwest conference. That's an interesting place for the CDC to be. Obviously, I'm hearing kind of, the focus of your work, but what were you there speaking on specifically? What can you share about that?
So it was amazing to be at South by Southwest because we were able to share that public health perspective and also listen in from the gamers community and the communications entertainment community's perspective. It was wonderful. And the study that you're referring to, Laura, is a study that we are pending publication regarding gamers, online adults in the United States that play video games and their experiences that they have online, specifically cyberbullying experiences, their motivations and reasons for playing video games, and social engagement that happens while they're playing video games with others online. And the importance why we're doing this is because the findings will help us better understand what is happening when people are playing online video games and identify opportunities for prevention. Also, by different subgroups, see if there are any differences and how we can tailor messaging and approaches for them. And we found, consistent with what we've seen reported elsewhere, that nearly half of US adults report playing video games online with others. Interesting. Most of them are youth and young adults. We know that, but that overlaps also with the population that has the heaviest burden for community violence. So from our field, yes, there's a connection. There's an overlap and opportunities. And therefore, it could be a potential venue also for intervention and for disseminating messages. 3 in 5 of US adults is estimated that they play online with others, mostly people that they know. But yet 2 in 10 of those US adults that play video games do not self-identify as video game players. They wouldn't say that they're video game players. So that's interesting. What about the self-identification? Do they feel part of the video gaming community or not? That has implications for our messaging and how we engage in online gaming communities.
So what about you then, Melissa? You mentioned that your partner is a gamer. Do you consider yourself to be a gamer?
Originally, I didn't. I was part of those 2 in 10. I didn't, but I am a faithful Bejeweled player, and I will take you on Pac-Man.
Okay, game on. We love those challenges.
Game on.
Amazing. What really surprised you the most about the research? What was your kind of aha moment when you really realized that something really stood out?
Well, it was very notable to me that a big proportion of US adults are estimated to endorse empathy towards fellow players. And that is very important. But a lower proportion endorse, doing something about it, or may not know what they need to do about it. So that's a challenge. They might feel for what's happening, what they see, and they will want to do something, but do they do it? Do they not? What is the challenge? That we need to explore further. And this study was focused on cyberbullying, right? But we also need to look at other forms of violence, and there's more in the works.
So just one follow-up question on that. So a lot of our audience out there are parents and caregivers, educators, policymakers. What would be your key takeaways? I know that the whole thing's not been shared yet, but what couple of top tips or takeaways would you give for those audiences? Maybe one each would be amazing.
For parents, well, we found from our study that most US adults are playing with people they know, mainly family members. So there's an opportunity there, right, to engage, to connect with children and families. But there are also a proportion of users, of players that are playing with people that they don't know. And that doesn't mean that it's bad. There could be very strong connections and communities that happens with that. There's learning experiences, skill building that happens online. So let's leverage that in this new playground that our children are exposed to, and try to understand that a little bit better. Where they're playing and playing with them could be important. But also recognize the risks that are out there as well. There's the good and the bad. I think with any type of interpersonal interaction, whether it's virtual or in person, we need to be mindful of the challenges and the risks for children and youth.
So, are the trends that you identified, or any of the findings you had about online violence, how do they match up with what we already know about real world violence, right? Brick and mortar violence? Like, is this a very different space, or is it sort of the same kind of patterns and perpetrators, or
We need more research. That's my answer, Jordan, because we're learning more. This literature review that I mentioned that we just completed, we've seen that there's been an increase in published scientific studies looking at online forms of violence in the past 10 years. And there are some forms of violence that are specific to online spaces. We're learning more about those as well. And that's very important, increasing the research to better understand what is happening online and how to address it. That is something that has been emphasized. We've seen reports coming out calling for additional research, and we're committed to doing our part in making that happen.
Yeah, I want to ask you about something else. When I was prepping for this episode, I saw that your team has also done a lot of work around adolescent mental health and the impact of COVID. And I'm kind of curious, like, are there really you hear anecdotally all about the pandemic babies all the time? Like, what do we actually know so far? Like, I hear it from my colleagues at the university. The pandemic made kids this way. I'm sure there's impact, but I want to know what we know versus what is just sort of like gossip.
Yeah, good question, Jordan.
We're starting to know. There are a couple of studies that have come out from CDC and from others, looking at data from that specific pandemic time, looking at adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and their risk of exposure. We've seen some increases in some forms of ACEs. There's been publications about that. But we've also seen, and this one I can talk to you about because I was leading that research, parents' concern about children's bullying before the pandemic and now. Overall, it kind of stayed the same. But if you look at the parents that say that their concern increased, it increased because they saw that they were tying into racism, or because they were concerned about the pandemic situation. And in terms of decreasing, one of the reasons that was mentioned was because they were not at school. The kids were not in school. And that is, as a public health practitioner and a violence prevention researcher, is concerning to me, because bullying is not only and not always limited to the four walls of the school or the school campus, right? Or the school location and events. It can happen online. So they were still at school. They were virtually at school. They were not physically in it. So do we understand how cyberbullying can work through online spaces? More for research that we need to look into.
Yeah. And of course, what we do know with online bullying is just how pervasive it is. That in the old days, if you got bullied at school, you would go home. And if you were lucky, you lived in a different place than the bullies, and, you were kind of safe in your house. But as we know these days, it just follows you wherever you are. It's in your pocket, on your phone. It's, and any platform you use, whether it be a gaming platform or social media. So I think helping parents to really understand that in the light of what you're saying is really, really important. Interesting.
And for youth, and you're right, Laura, and for youth, online spaces and physical spaces are not independent one from the other.
Yeah.
For kids, sometimes the relationship that they have in person, then they continue the relationship and the interactions online. So I don't know, sometimes we think that they're two distinct worlds, not so much. And the
Continue.
No,
pandemic might have
absolutely.
made that
Sometimes I
blur
see my
even
kid.
more.
Sometimes I see my kids sitting in the park and they're all just online together on their phones.
Yeah,
It's not
side
even a
by
good
Together,
side.
right?
situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I always try to put a positive spin on everything. And I think one of the good things to remember is that while these sort of things can happen online and they can be really negative for young people, but equally, that's where they find their people. There is a huge amount of support for them, both whether it be, finding access to services that they might want to speak to, or actually just their friends that are online. We do see a lot of that kind of upstander behavior where people will step in and really try to support people who are having a bad time, but also step in and challenge those who are doing it. So there's always the yin and the yang with anything to do with online spaces, I think. Well, this has been really, really fascinating, and I know that we're really looking forward to seeing the research that we've talked about and what comes next. But what's next for you in your role, and what's next for the CDC? What projects have you got coming up that might be interesting to our audience?
Well, I mentioned this is a first of a couple of studies that we have in the works regarding gaming communities to try to better understand gamers' experiences while they're playing internet-connected video games. We have some work coming up regarding sexism and misogyny. Another one taking a deeper dive into cyberbullying. And we continue to have internal and external collaborations for research, for translation and dissemination activities with the communications industry, with academic partners. We want to fill that gap, help fill that gap on research that is needed in this space for our kids and for our communities as well.
Thanks, Melissa. So, as we said, we have a lot of policymakers and parents who listen in on this podcast. Where would they be able to find those bits of research? Where would they go to look if they wanted to read up on some of these things?
Well, there's some information on our website. The research specifically that I was talking about today is still pending publication, so that will be coming up, and I'll be happy to share with you afterwards. But I would say stay tuned because there's more coming up.
Anything we should have asked you about that you want to make sure we cover?
One thing that I wanted to mention is norms in online spaces, about norms in online spaces. Sometimes maybe those may need to be re-examined or look more deeply into. We were talking about, the example of my husband, right, playing with his friend, and is it that violence or is it not violence? It could be friendly competition, but I wonder if we all players understand the consequences that those interactions can have online. So additional research is needed with that. Additional data is needed to better understand it from the industry. This is a survey, what we did for our study. So this is self-report, but definitely different sources of information and different approaches are needed. It's not just on the parents. It's not just on researchers. It's not just on teachers. It's not just on policymakers. This needs to be concentrated, coordinated, or maybe collaborative. Maybe that's a better word, collaborative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this message that just more and more and more research is needed. Jordan and I both geek out on this stuff all the time. And actually, there has just been an announcement by the UK government, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, literally a call to action on more research into the video games industry and the effects, positive and negative, that it has on people. So this is obviously a global movement. Let's see all this research coming. And hey, maybe we'll get you on next year. You can come and tell us about the latest studies that you're doing, Melissa.
Yes, maybe we can. It's been a pleasure, and I am always happy to contribute and collaborate. We're on this together. We have a same goal, which is the safety and health of our children and our families.
What do you play when you're not playing Pac-Man?
Oh, when I'm playing Pac-Man, Bejeweled. Or anything that is a puzzle, really. Matching numbers or colors or shapes, I'm there.
I know
Amazing.
I know the feeling. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure.
Thank you, Melissa.
Same here. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Into the Digital Future. We hope you had as much fun listening as we had talking. For links and resources about any of the ideas, projects, or initiatives we discussed on this episode, please visit the CUNY Center website at cunycenter.org/future.
Into the Digital Future has been brought to you by Roblox and the Joan Gans CUNY Centre at Sesame Workshop. Your hosts are Jordan Shapiro and Laura Higgins. Matt Clark is our audio editor and production coordinator. We invite you to subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss any episodes on Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, and more.